On July 20, 1969, the world collectively held its breath as Neil Armstrong, the commander of Apollo 11, took that famous first step onto the moon. His words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," echoed across the globe, a statement that became synonymous with the boundless potential of human achievement. But behind the serene picture of a man standing on the lunar surface, there lay a world of unseen struggles, high-stakes politics, and personal sacrifices. The moon landing wasn't just a triumph of science and technology. It was the culmination of years of peril, a race against time, and a test of willpower that nearly pushed every person involved to their limits. And at the heart of it all was a relentless, often unseen pressure. Pressure not just to succeed, but to do so in the face of potentially disastrous failure. The story of Apollo 11 began long before that fateful day in 1969. It started in the shadow of a world still recovering from the devastation of World War II, where nations were not only rebuilding their economies but also their reputations. The Cold War was in full swing, and space was the final frontier in the battle for supremacy between the United States and the Soviet Union. The race to land a man on the moon was more than a scientific mission. It was a political statement, a demonstration of power, and, for many, a question of survival. John F. Kennedy, then President of the United States, made the bold decision in 1961 to put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. But Kennedy's dream wasn't just about space exploration. It was about sending a message to the world that the US would not be overshadowed by the Soviet Union. The race was on, and it was a race for more than just the moon. It was a race for dominance in the space age, one where the stakes couldn't have been higher. Behind the polished speeches and televised triumphs were the unsung heroes, the engineers, the astronauts, the scientists, who worked tirelessly in the background. They knew the odds. Every new mission revealed a potential new disaster. For every successful test, there was a failure lurking in the wings, threatening to unravel everything they had worked for. The astronauts who would eventually make history on Apollo 11 knew this more than anyone. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins were fully aware that they were pushing the limits of human endurance, both physically and psychologically. It was not just the science that was at stake. It was their lives. The pressure was constant, each day more intense than the last. The astronauts underwent grueling training, simulating every scenario they could think of, from equipment failure to oxygen deprivation, to sudden decompression of the cabin. They spent countless hours in isolation, rehearsing every move they would make in the cold, unforgiving environment of space. And it wasn't just about survival, it was about success. One mistake could result in failure, not only for the mission but for the entire nation. But the stakes were even higher for Armstrong. He was a man of few words, more comfortable with action than speech. Yet in the years leading up to Apollo 11, he was thrust into the spotlight, a man who would lead a mission whose success or failure would be remembered forever. In those days, every decision felt like a potential last. Every movement he made was scrutinized. Every moment of doubt, every fear, was buried beneath a stoic exterior that only those closest to him could understand. Armstrong's journey wasn't just physical, it was emotional. He was carrying the weight of an entire nation's expectations on his shoulders. On July 16, 1969, the world held its breath again as Apollo 11 lifted off from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The spacecraft, powered by a Saturn V rocket, climbed into the sky with thunderous force. On board were three men: Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. For these men, the climb into space wasn't just a career achievement, it was a defining moment in their lives. But as the rocket tore through the atmosphere, they left behind everything they knew: family, friends, comfort, and entered the unknown.
Hey there, if you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our exciting adventures. Now let's get back to the mystery.
The journey to the moon was long and treacherous. As Apollo 11 cruised toward the moon, the crew was constantly adjusting, monitoring, and recalibrating. Their survival depended on thousands of tiny adjustments, each one a matter of life and death. The mission wasn't just a race against the Soviets, it was a race against time, a test of endurance, a test of character. The further they went into space, the farther they were from home, the more isolated they became. But it wasn't until they neared the moon that the true danger of the mission began to unfold. As the lunar module separated from the command module and descended toward the moon's surface, disaster seemed inevitable. The landing site was a barren, uncharted area. No one knew what to expect. Armstrong was at the controls, guiding the spacecraft toward a safe landing, but the computer system was malfunctioning. The descent was a chaotic flurry of data, warning lights flashing, alarms blaring. Armstrong and Aldrin were forced to take manual control, flying the module just feet above the lunar surface, dodging rocks and craters that could have sent them crashing to their deaths. Every moment felt like an eternity, the tension in the cabin thick enough to cut with a knife. They were inches away from the moon, but also inches away from disaster. But Armstrong's steady hand and calm demeanor kept them going. With every passing second, the pressure mounted, and just as the fuel tank was about to run dry, Armstrong brought the lunar module down with only seconds to spare. The Eagle had landed. The first words that came over the radio, "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed," marked the beginning of a new chapter in human history. But while the world celebrated, the men on the moon were still living on the edge of disaster. Armstrong and Aldrin had only hours before they had to return to the lunar module and rejoin Collins in the command module. As Armstrong stepped onto the surface of the moon, he wasn't just thinking about the millions of people watching. He was thinking about the countless hours of training, the risks they had taken, and the lives that had been lost in earlier space missions. He was thinking about the people who had given everything for this moment, and the future they were about to carve out. The weight of the world still hung heavy on his shoulders, but it was now clear. They had done it. They had taken the impossible and made it possible. For Aldrin, the moment was equally monumental, though less visible to the public eye. As Armstrong made his historic step, Aldrin stood silently in the background, his thoughts deep. He had his own doubts, his own battles. His pride in the achievement was immense, but so too was the pressure he felt, the pressure of being the second man on the moon. It was a monumental achievement, but it also came with its own set of struggles, both internal and external. But the true weight of the mission wasn't just in the success of the landing, it was in the journey back. For Apollo 11, the hardest part wasn't landing on the moon. It was leaving. The journey back to Earth was fraught with challenges of its own. They had survived the risks of the moon landing, but now they faced the unknown once more. The re-entry was another trial, another test of faith as they plummeted back toward Earth, not knowing if the heat shields would hold, if the parachutes would open, if they would survive the final leg of their journey. On July 24, 1969, Apollo 11 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. The crew was recovered and the world erupted in celebration. But for Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, the journey had only just begun. They were celebrated as heroes, yet the emotional toll of their experience lingered. Armstrong, the quiet, stoic leader, would struggle with the fame, retreating from the spotlight and living a life of quiet reflection. Aldrin, who had struggled with the weight of being second, would battle his own demons, but ultimately, the journey would make him a lifelong advocate for space exploration. Collins, too, would find his place in history, but his time in space was largely solitary, his role often overlooked, yet no less critical. Apollo 11 had completed its mission. But the true legacy of the moon landing lies not in the footprints left behind on the lunar surface, but in the lives of those who lived through it. The pressure, the risks, the sacrifices, they were all part of a journey that was never just about reaching the moon. It was about pushing the boundaries of human endurance, about standing on the precipice of failure and finding the strength to rise above it. The true story of Apollo 11 is not one of simple triumph, but of an unyielding will to overcome the darkest of obstacles and reach for the stars.